If the Saints want to address the tight end position in the upcoming NFL draft, they won't have to look too far to find a really good option at that position. Mason Taylor from LSU could be a good fit for the New Orleans Saints. We'll talk about that right here on the Straight Up Saints podcast.
You're listening to the Straight Up Saints podcast.
What is up, Who Dat Nation? Welcome inside another edition of the Straight Up Saints podcast. I'm your host, Chris Rosvoglu, and as always, the Straight Up Saints podcast is brought to you by Scott McNair, injury lawyers who've been injured in any kind of accident, car, truck, 18-wheeler, or hurt offshore. Scott McNair handles it all. You give him a call at 504-500-1111 for a free consultation. They'll always fight for the win. The NFL Combine just wrapped up in Indy, and one of the position groups that I thought really stood out was the tight end group, and I think one guy in particular for the Saints would make a lot of sense, and that is Mason Taylor. Now, before I get into why I think Mason Taylor makes a lot of sense for the Saints, why I like him as a prospect, and I believe the Saints need to address this position, I just want to put this out there. There are a lot of people who are going to like Mason Taylor because he's a really, really intriguing football prospect, and there's going to be a lot of people that just like that he's from LSU. I want to throw this out here. I am not an LSU fan. I actually don't have a favorite college football team, and I've said it very often over the last couple of years, but I don't have a favorite college football team, so I'm not biased towards LSU. I'm not partial to LSU. Whether LSU wins or loses football games doesn't really dictate my mood in any capacity, and whether or not the Saints draft players from LSU or not doesn't really impact me much at all. It comes down to, do I think you're a good football player or not? So yeah, even though it was impossible, I would have loved to seen a Joe Burrow or Jaden Daniels on a Saints team. Obviously, it was never feasible in the first place, though, because they couldn't draft those guys. But are you a good football player or not? That's what matters to me. And when I see Mason Taylor, I see a guy who looks pretty polished in his route running, who can give you an added element of physicality. I think he tracks the football very well down the field, which is important. I think when he gets the ball in his hands, he's a good mover. I don't think he's got top-line speed. And obviously, when you look at this combine that just passed, you saw a couple of tight ends in the 4.6s. I don't think Mason Taylor is the type of guy that's going to give you that top speed, but it's good enough. It's adequate speed, I would say. And I just think this is a football player that when you plug him into the Saints, where they have that position of need, he's going to be an immediate impact guy. And I know that the Saints have other needs, and tight end has always felt like a luxury pick. I think tight end's a luxury pick if you take it early. You know, if the Saints at 9 get Tyler Warren from Penn State, who, by the way, is an excellent prospect. Excellent. And, I saw last week people were comparing him to Jeremy Shockey, and I'm like, I kind of love that comparison. I think maybe at 9, I don't know if I'm going tight end. That's too rich for my blood when you don't have everything. It needs to be generational. And as good as Tyler Warren is, when I saw Brock Bowers years ago as a freshman at Georgia, I was like, this kid's fucking special. Like, you saw how special he was from the rip. I think Tyler Warren's really good. I don't think Tyler Warren's Brock Bowers level. So the Saints at 9, you can go D-line, you can go wide receiver, you can go cornerback if Will Johnson falls. You can go positions that, are valued higher than the tight end position. That said, day 2, Mason Taylor's on the board. You need to upgrade the position. You go for it. I think Mason Taylor would absolutely give this position group a massive upgrade. As I mentioned before, I love the toughness. I think he's got reliable hands. He's a pretty good route runner. He can make those tough contested catches over the middle of the field. And when you look at the Eagles this past year with Kellen Moore, we're going to talk about Saquon Barkley and how great he is. And obviously, A.J. Brown's an explosive player. Dallas Goedert, had he played the full season, probably would have had the best season of his career. He played in 10 games. There's 7 games that he missed. And you saw him have just about 500 receiving yards. So, I think you can plug Mason Taylor into the Saints offense. And no, at the rip, he's not going to be Dallas Goedert, but he's going to give you an immediate upgrade. And I think that makes so much sense for the Saints. And we look at his position group. Juwan Johnson, first off, are you keeping him? He's a free agent. I don't think Juwan Johnson is very special at that position. He's got his moments, but he's not special. Foster Moreau, solid role player. I'd love for the Saints to keep Foster Moreau around. I think he's a nice guy to have, but he's not a tight end 1. Juwan Johnson's not a tight end 1. So you get rid of those 2, move him out of the equation for a sec, okay? Dallin Holker, we liked him in camp, us Saints fans. We liked him in the preseason. He's got a long way to go. We don't know if he's ever going to be a starting tight end or even number 2 tight end in terms of being consistent at that position. So you have to get better. Taysom Hill, is he going to be on the roster? We'll see. And even if he is, that's not really a tight end. That's a weapon. So, you put Mason Taylor into this Saints offense. You're immediately upgrading the position. You're getting younger at the position, which is important. And I think you're finally adding a guy to this roster that you look at him and you say, okay, that can be your tight end for the next 5-10 years, hopefully the 10, if he ends up being that dude. And the Saints haven't had that since Jimmy Graham. And they're not even remotely similar players, in my opinion. Obviously, Jimmy Graham is, prime Jimmy's in a class of his own. But the Saints have rotated through that position post Jimmy Graham. Because if it wasn't Ben Watson, it was Kobe Fleener. If it wasn't Kobe Fleener, you go get Jared Cook. And if it wasn't Jared Cook, we saw the Juwan Johnson experiment. And then the Saints just haven't had that guy. And I think Mason Taylor genuinely can be a really good tight end in this league. And, I mentioned Dallas Goedert before. Dallas Goedert's never going to be mentioned in that George Kittle, Travis Kelce, now Brock Bowers conversation. But when you get through the top end guys, like the top 3 guys, Goddard's usually the one you mention around that 4, 5, 6 range. And I think Mason Taylor could hypothetically be that guy. And, it's silly to look at a combine and be like, oh, this sold me. But, we watched the gauntlet drill. And obviously it's tough to say the gauntlet defines anything because, you're just trying to run down a straight line. Some guys kind of zigzag out of control a little bit. And you're turning left and right catching passes. But, man, Mason Taylor ran that thing so freaking straight, so smooth. And I don't know, I just feel like he's a clean prospect. I feel like you bring him to New Orleans, I think he's going to have success immediately. I really do. And I think it's important with Kellen Moore as the head coach, you got to start getting pieces that are going to fit his offense. You will adapt to certain players because, Kellen Moore has mentioned, got to have every player's superpowers and coach to them. And I love that answer. And when you get an Olave in your offense, you're going to coach to his strengths. When you get a Rashid Shaheed, you coach to his strengths. Alvin, at this age, you still coach to his strengths. But you got to start getting some pieces that Kellen Moore handpicked. I feel like Mason Taylor makes a lot of sense for his offense. I really do. He could be kind of your Dallas Goedert 2.0 in New Orleans. So we'll see what happens. But, man, I love the idea of the Saints adding Mason Taylor. And this is coming from someone who, like I mentioned, I'm not an LSU fan. The LSU aspect of it doesn't matter to me. Are you a good football player or not? I believe Mason Taylor will be one, and especially if he joins the Saints. So, Mason Taylor, do you like the idea of New Orleans drafting the LSU tight end? Let me know in the comments section below. And as always, guys, subscribe to Boo Crew Media and stay tuned for more content here from the Straight Up Saints podcast, the destination for the Who Dat Nation.